Okay, I think we are on the mark. Let's get our little opening logo out of the way. A little late today because I was finishing a bug, but at least it's off my chest. La-di-da. At least I am income tax than Donald Trump, but that's a low bar these days. Okie doke. Well, anyway, of course, we are doing with our snotty little diatribe going into Titans, the Creationist book, with Jonathan Sarfati and Joel Tay. And this is a Casey Luskin week, as I was warning you about 2 weeks ago and last week, relating to the mysterious notch and all the little fun parts that have come up about that one. That will be a story we will get into. Anyway, hope everybody that will be watching, or so far nobody in the overlay, I remember I'm starting about an hour late, my bad, can comment and jump in as they will. So the chapter in Sarfati and Tay are still slogging along on the herbivorous versus carnivorous theropod. Hi, Lisa. Sarfati and Tay decree that, quote, "we know that around half of them were vegetarians at the time of the flood," unquote. Channeling their own 2011 post with Sarfati and Lita Sanders, aka Cosner. It's under varying names when you find it, when you look at it at CMI versus other things. It's kind of confusing. I think she got married at some point or other, and so they're often confused as to which name they're under. Anyway, and then they immediately cited a 2010 paper by Longrich, which they had previously double dipped on cannibalistic tyrannosaurs. I'll be putting a link up to that little thing. So the fun fact, of course, is that Sarfati and Tay's own book on the theropod taxa have 98% of them categorized as carnivores. I think the only one they bumped into, which they could kind of make that argument, were therizinosaurs, and those are a tiny proportion of the thing. So they're rather than bravado. In Rocks Volume 2, we're going to be having a really neat breakdown of the whole carnivory thing. Thought they say all of them were. This has been an evolutionary process that has been going on in the creationist community, which Rocks for their Volume 2 will be going into. That it was pretty much dogma in the young earth creationist community in the Henry Morris era that all carnivory came after the flood. And as the more and more creationist paleontologists and that came along scene, and there was more and more data coming along, it became really impossible for that to be entertained. So they've had to, most of them have moved backwards to the contention that carnivory came after the fall of Adam, which can account for therefore carnivorous things that are evidenced in the critters that die in the flood. So farther, when you move farther down this food chain, they get wimpier and wimpier and wimpier onto that little process. At any rate, Sarfati and Tay also cite a 2017 paper from Chin that I'll be putting up a link to as well, that's finding processed wood and crustacean parts in some Cretaceous coprolites, likely from hadrosaurs or ceratopsids, during suggesting they were dining not super selectively, but on decaying wood and whatever was in there, which would include little crustaceans. And it's actually an interesting little paper, but that's also allowing them to kind of double dip the idea that a herbivore could be carnivorous relatively easily. That's the implication that they're trying to do on it. Anyway, it's a wonderful little sidebar to learn, because you'll actually learn some nice science material from the technical papers, and you can compare it with the Sarfati and Sanders 2011 creation post to kind of look at the ballpark area there. I'll also give you a heads up as to some manna from heaven that came regarding a little info box that I'm working on the cosmology chapter for Rocks 2, relating to supernova. There was this guy, Keith Davies, who back in 1994 did a presentation that was contending that way fewer supernova were being detected than should be predicted if the universe were as old as the standard evolutionary model we're putting it. And this started to get some pushback from various skeptics along the way by the early 2000s, but there were a long string, Russell Humphreys and Jonathan Sarfati and Danny Faulkner, who were pushing this at the time. And what is intriguing is how it has transformed down the line. We've got several examples that we're going to be alluding to, including a delicious hit from the late Bill Ludlow regarding this guy, Conover, who has a long string. And they're still available, these video lectures dating from 2018, where he was still pushing Keith Davies' argument. But the really delicious one is the evolution of Danny Faulkner. So Faulkner goes from 1998, where he is accepting Davies's argument at face value, to 2007, when he's starting to get a little more circumspect and just simply alluding to it. So herbivorous system became carnivorous kind of overnight. Yeah, kind of overnight. They would have to have really drastic modifications to the metabolism in here, and bless their little hearts, other than just simply waving at technical papers about various critters that can eat varying forms of things. They don't go into the detailed metabolism. I think in large part, I don't think any of them are familiar enough with the technical literature to dive that far into it. So it's done as a pretty peripheral detail. Anyway, back to Faulkner. So then a decade goes by between the 2007 thing and the 2017 one. 2017 is when he drops the boom at Answers in Genesis Answers Research Journal, where he flat out accuses Davies of bad research, siphoning actually the material from the Talk Origins criticisms that were put back in 2000s, and actively saying that creationists should not use the supernova argument anymore. He does not dive into who were these creationists who were making this claim, other than a brief aside about Don DeYoung. But he doesn't mention Humphreys, he doesn't mention Sarfati, and he doesn't mention himself because he had been on that list. So it's a little bit far from a mea culpa thing. The sidebar is that Sarfati, same Sarfati as do in our Dinosaur Titans books, drew a line in the sand in his 1997 post, which is constantly being retread at CMI and others. It pops up and various people are drawing on it, where he was indicating that there's three stages of supernova, and you've got the first one that lasts a few hundred years. That's basically the part. Then the cloud is spreading out over the next 100,000 years or so. That's kind of very distinctive. And then the long fade out into wispiness can run up to 5 or 6 million years. Well, it's that stage 3 phase where Sarfati draws the line in the sand to say that not only are none known according to the Davies analysis, but none should be known. It was impossible. There shouldn't even be one of these stage 3 supernova because it was impossible. Nothing has been around long enough for a stage 3 supernova to have occurred. Fine and dandy. Except by the time you get down to Danny Faulkner, it's patently obvious that there are a whole bunch of them. And how many of them can be dated back over 1 million years is quite another matter. But certainly there are quite a few that you can get in the 300,000 range and that. So that line in the sand didn't last all that long. So it's a deliciously hilarious thing. And I'm trying to be as meticulous as possible to have a really tight cataloging of the current up-to-date views. And in some cases, there's been flip-flops as big gaseous blobs of hydrogen are hard to tell apart at times, unless you look at other variables, from the third stage or even second stage of a supernova. And so you can find some things in terms of certain kinds of radiation that you can get. In fact, you can even find they've traced back some examples of supernovas that have bathed the planet and triggered off unusual radioactive forms of aluminum that are distinctive to supernova, and those have been trapped in our rocks. So we've got some interesting little tidbits there. We've actually been moving into this little void area for a few million years, where that's been blasted out by apparently a lot of supernovas over the years. So anyway, all of that's really quite fun. We'll move on then to our happy little part 2, which is the Notch 2NLB gene thing. This one came up quite by accident because a brand new paper from 2025 occurred where, from ISOC et al. 2025, and I'll be putting a link up to that one in the descriptions, which is all about a dyad of human-specific cortical genes that involve that notch thing. And it relates to the fact that there's variations in, whoops, there we go. What are polonium halos? Oh, excellent question. That's also is going to be covered in volume 2 of Rocks. The big kid here primarily is Robert Gentry. And greetings. Hello. Polonium halos, there's various decay change that occur. Polonium is a thing that has, when you have decay chains inside of certain kinds of rocks, they'll produce basically a bathtub ring of radiation at a particular distance from the radioactive material that is constantly dumping crap out. So you can find these rings of these things that can be caused as an element in a radioactive thing trapped in mica and other kinds of things is gradually decaying and turning into new elements that then produce a different ring at a different distance. Gentry spotted what seemed to be isolated polonium halo rings that didn't have the associated parts that would suggest that it was the end product of a radioactive cycle. Well, part of the difficulty is that crystals can have permeability, and one of the features of the chain that leads to polonium is going through radon, which is a little gas that can get all over the place, and you know, it can leak into houses and so forth and so on. So in other words, you can have the daughter product of radon leaking into another spot in a crystal, and it then starts its own chain as it continues the decay chain, but its parents that occurred earlier are gone because it's migrated as a gas. Needless to say, Gentry has not been particularly forthcoming on this stuff. By the way, he put this stuff up in regular science journals. The early papers on this stuff were in Science magazine in the late 1960s. But of course, he had an axe to grind beyond this, and he thinks, for example, that we're the center of the universe and that the God's throne, he's located in a particular spot, and he's got a whole bunch of wacky little baggage. But polonium halos, then, yours in my playlist to listen to tomorrow, yes. So polonium halos continue to pop up, and the rate group was even banging this drum, and to some extent since then, as though it were a real thing. But there's been just way too much sidebar material on there that even some of the creationists have kind of wend off of it in the same way that Danny Faulkner was doing on the supernova thing. So on to good old Notch. This brand new paper then that I'll be putting the link up to suddenly made me think, wait a minute, Notch, this particular gene, I wonder if the Luskin list has anything on Notch. And it turns out 3 papers. So I kind of jumped ahead. All the papers that they're drawing on are actually farther down the list by a long margin, not in the ALU section, but down in introns and a few other points, of which one paper is a more generic one, which I really wonder why the hell I put it up there at all. Let's see where I'm at on the, there's one from 2008 that he has on the list from Grogan on Notch signaling. It's not open access, unfortunately, but I'm putting a link up to the abstract so that you can find, which doesn't seem to have any transposon or junk DNA relevance at all. So I'm kind of puzzled as to what the hell he thought to be doing on the subject. But the other 2 directly are about the Notch matter. there's a 2018 paper by Suzuki from Cell. I'll be putting the whole link up on that one. And the really zingy poo one is from this guy, Fides et al. 2018, which is dealing specifically with the retrotransposons and stuff, and not signaling that's involved with our own little brains and cortical evolution. Now, that was very intriguing because this has opened up a whole line of argument. There's a 2019 paper that Fides worked on, which was going into more specific material on the genes in human brain evolution. And they were also starting to pay attention to the fact that there are human-specific variations between us and Denisovans and Neanderthals. And so this more recent material is really built off of all of that. I'm also going to be tossing in an older paper from 2005, which will go into the gene duplications and stuff that generated the bigger Notch family, of which the Notch 2 and L stuff is a detail. And there's also a detailed paper, Ludwig 2020, which will be going into that fun stuff on the Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so there's the interesting issue that some of the dynamics of our cortical evolution development has been because we have slightly different versions of these Notch genes that our relatives have. And they'll be exploring bit by bit as to figure out what's going on there. But they are further reinforcement of the idea that Denisovans, and I think they just found a partial body parts of some Denisovans from Taiwan just very, very recently, and they've been able to pull DNA off of that little puppy. And there's still, so the fossil data on Denisovans are very, very limited so far. But the Neanderthal is quite a bit different on that. It all is reinforcing the idea that they are close relatives enough to boink with, but not actually our species. And so I was thinking, good gravy, should they have brought up Notch? This specific thing. I'm wondering when they decided to put the papers on their list. Was it just because, wow, there's in relation to human evolution, so there must be something really important there, without really diving into the details of what the contents were, let alone the follow-up material, because the 2019 and the Ludwig 2020 predates their list. So they could have had that on there too, but they didn't. So very, very persnickety and puppy woo. Also, I'll be putting a link up to a video that Dan Stern Cardinale just recently did, where he's remarking on the Discovery Institute's Evolution News post from Daniel Witt, which is riffing off some junk RNA comments from Nobel Prize winning biochemist Thomas Seck. And basically it's riffing some material from his new book. The book's publisher description alludes to how RNA, quote, may have jump-started life itself, unquote. So it's likely that Seck's books discovered his pioneering work on ribozymes and its implications for early life. But none of that was being alluded to in the Witt post. It's all about some grumps that he was having about how much of functionality and junk DNA and RNA was seen. And remember, he's kind of an older fellow. Most of the work that he was doing in this field was back in the 20th century and up to like 2005, 10, 12, around in that period. So he's been very seminal in that, but not necessarily realizing the implications of what he's been arguing about, that it's to some extent a tempest in a teapot. And so Dan Stern Cardinale's video will go into all that little fun stuff and some bone depicts on that. And I said I'll have that. We'll link to that and the Witt piece, so you can look that up, where you can read the full quotes that they're gleaning from the book. That brand of authority quoting is pathological in the anti-evolution movement. I would contend that the vast majority of what you find in apologetics runs into that mode, either from people being diligent and generating the quote mines themselves, or far more commonly simply glomming onto other people's quote mines and repeating things ad nauseum. So we can assume that Seck's stuff will get, that's CECH, by the way. Oh, well, might as well type his old name up on here so you have if you want to Google the fellow, Thomas Seck. He was already in my reference bibliography because of his work on ribozymes. For those who aren't up on ribozymes, the core of the ribosome, that is the little mechanism inside of cells where RNA comes through and amino acids are figured out to make proteins and out the end. And by the way, the speed of that in cellular construction is blindingly fast. It's not slow. That the core of that is an RNA molecule, and that RNA molecules have turned out to have catalytic processes that DNA doesn't, and that's where the ribozyme comes in. And so it was not unusual for him to be pondering the implications that this would have for the development of life. The current things are starting to think about the idea that RNA is having interactions with protein structures and the amino acids directly, and that there's a mechanism of why amino acids get associated with particular RNA triplets ultimately and their DNA counterparts. All of that chicken and egg complexity of how that system develops is still a fascinating ongoing problem, and I don't consider it a resolved one by any means. But boy, we sure as hell know a hell of a lot more about this subject than we did when I was growing up and reading stuff from the 1950s and 60s. What we have learned is not helping the designer argument all that much, but we proceed. Is it true that the brightest stars are actually galaxies? Actually, it's very hard. Of what you can see in a naked eye are almost no galaxies. It's hard to tell. There's only a handful of ones that are visible to the naked eye as just little smudges. The Andromeda Nebula, it was a long time until they got really powerful telescopes. They didn't realize that was actually a galaxy of stars. You can see maybe 10,000 or so stars if you got really good eyeballs and aren't living in places with too much light pollution. And where I live would be light pollution land. In fact, all the astronomers, amateur astronomers in the region, have to go out into the middle of nowhere, to be able to get good enough skies to be able to look at stuff. You've got a whole class of material. Some galaxies are brighter than others, depending on what's in there. Quasars are these funky little things that are ultimately deemed very old and early forms of stellar systems. It's been funky to figure out how quickly stars developed in the early universe, which is a little faster in some respects than what had been thought of before. There was a long ongoing tussle in decades past as to how heavier elements get generated, and it turns out those are involving supernovas and sometimes collisions of neutron stars, and there's a lot of processes that go on that dump stuff out. So the star formation stuff is ongoing. But in terms of brightness, of course, when you have to remember how dim everything is, the farther it is away. And since most of the universe is much farther than a couple million light years, everything is very, very dim indeed. So there's only a handful of galactic things. There's that the early big telescopes were able to get a lot more stuff out of it. But functionally, all the stuff that you're going to be seeing with the naked eye are nearby stars and planets. And it was therefore quite an unnerving shock to realize that the little black spaces in between the stars actually are crammed up to the gunnels with galaxies that are so dim that you have to have very powerful instruments to do them. Or in the case of really, really, really far away stuff, have redshifted so much that they're not in the optical frequencies at all. And that's why you had to build the James Webb Space Telescope that was specifically designed to be much more precise for that infrared region, to be able to spot the very distant galaxies. That's still far enough back that there's going to be a nice, neat little chart. Quasars are lighthouses to help interstellar ships navigate. Yeah, okay, it makes a good story, though. There's going to be a neat little chart in the new book that will break down all of the current model and nice little explanatory boxes to cluster things together, and color shading to indicate temperature ranges as the universe cools off and expands and all that kind of stuff. And so you've got this big box that says Dark Age. That's the point prior to the formation of the first stars. That's from about 370,000 years to about 150 million years after the actual Big Bang part. What intrigued me when I was getting all the little numbers plugged together is the not constant thing. If you're thinking about the universe forming in kind of constant ticks, not true. When you're in the earliest stages, you've got Planck time, which is really, really short, 10 to the minus 43rd seconds. And sometimes you're talking about a few thousand Planck ticks for some things happening, and then others thing takes millions of Planck ticks, and then another set beyond that is only a few thousand. And so everything is kind of blah, 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 but that's all taking place in under a second. As things slow down, the universe is expanding. And there's also the inflation phase that they think does a kind of where the universe gets much bigger really quick and then kind of settles down to the mode. And then there's that we've been seeing now. And there's still some concern as to whether or not that rate has changed any over time to where the universe might be speeding up a little bit or slowing down a little bit. And then, of course, this also involves the curvature of space. And, there's just a lot of variables. And if looks like everyone here has hit the thumb. Good job, team. Thank you. Yes, there we go. I gather I don't pay a hell of a lot of attention to all the little diagnostics that gives everybody else conniption fits, but I guess there are algorithms that when people hit the like, there's a little god out in the machinery department that pays attention to all of that. And I'm way below the level of monetization or anything like that, and I don't run the thing with the super chats and stuff that Dan Stern Cardinale and Erica and Dapper Dino and all of theirs will be running on their channels where they're actually getting people donating directly in the scratch, but people, I haven't gone in that thing. So, and there's no ads on our channel. That's another advantage of it. So you get my boring mug unalloyed without any sudden jumps to a PragerU commercial or something from idiot from Newsmax wanting your opinion about politics, which happens on people who are politically liberal and atheist, so you get this weird mixture of stuff where the adverts that are popping up on the YouTube are completely at odds with the viewpoints of the people involved. Well, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have any of that. Can't afford to pay attention. Why do you think you get these random comments? Yeah, Planck ticks are not parasites that sack the sap out of milkwood. No, sirree, no. It's named after the physicist Planck, and I've forgotten his first name right off the bank. So if you look at Planck time, there we go. And any attempt to deal with the very earliest stages of the universe, you're at that. Planck, one tick of the Planck clock is the time it takes light to go across the nucleus of a hydrogen atom, which ain't much. And that there's several different things as to whether an entire hydrogen atom all the way out to the first electron shell, which is a longer distance, but that sometimes is called a jiffy. Which I learned that a jiffy was the shortest one, 10 to the minus 43rd seconds, which is really, really fast because there's a Planck time in modern physics. There ain't nothing faster than a Planck time. One tick of the Planck clock, you can't have a shorter time frame. Maybe you can, I don't know, but they don't think of it in that terms. At least you have managed 1.4 subscribers. Okay, I'm still yet to get near the 1K mark. Yeah, I've got some people out there, and I'm sure there were people who were a little flummoxed when for the last few weeks I've been popping up on the old channel that was the standby one because I was having problems accessing my regular email mode on Restream, but that finally got back online. Cross fingers, knock wood. That will hold for a while. So there we go. I'm an acquired taste, hopefully. But the one thing that for take home on any channel that I try to exemplify on mine is that there should be bloody links. And so if you're talking about science issues where you're criticizing people and or you are offering evidence of things that relate to that criticism, I want to have links in there. And I don't go to the point of putting up every citation if I'm alluding to material that you don't have the full text on, or if not, I will call attention to it, like I'm doing this time, that there will be a link reference to an abstract rather than to the full paper. But for all practical purposes, I want you to be able to follow up everything I say. At no point should you have to take my word for it. I will defend my position and say I've been fair and reasonable. And in the years that I've been doing this, I haven't found anybody yet who has come up and said that I've misrepresented any of my sources. I think I'm pretty damn careful on that. I get occasional critics. You'll get some creationists that just go on blither blathering as they do, but that's neither here nor there. But the source material, I try to be damn careful on. Still muddling through the rocks for there and haven't yet got to any of your fiction yet. Yes. Well, remember, I've got 2 Paralogs of Fog novels out there. So come on, there we go. Which I will point to, boop, boop, up there. That's one of them. That's volume 2, the second story. I'm going to be doing a whole series of those little puppies. In the link section, every video, I've got links to not only the Patreon and the 2 science books, and I will be adding new ones as they pop along, but also both of the paralog stories. And if you like historical fiction, if you like Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, if you like Sherlock Holmes mysteries, adventure tales, and the like, if you always had a soft spot for Phileas Fogg and Around the World in 80 Days and all of that, then test it out. Take a stab. The books are available in either the paperback form or in ebooks. And I've been tinkering along this. Make sure I'm getting the current edition of the first book, because I corrected some typos and a few little minor details on that. So I'll bring the thing down. This was the cover that I came up with for the second paralog story, and the newer edition of the first story has this same angled format. I think with a picture of a kind of like London clock tower or something on it that I used. I would have loved to have. I had started to do an audio book where Suris, he got busy with a bunch of other stuff, so we were never able to finish it. But I was trying to record the bloody thing myself. I realized that that's probably a dangerous thing to do, especially for the second story, because there are a bunch of people in here that would probably have Australian accents, and I think I would be hideously bad doing those. So maybe we'll have to worry about that in later course. Oops. Come on, babies. There's also a prospect that a local guy that may, at some point, we may do the illustrated edition of the books, because I have a whole slew of photographs and things that were planned out for this, and he'd also be able to do illustrations of the various gizmos and things that I can't find a photograph for because they're just in my imagination. So I'd love to have them in audiobook sometime. And some people have dinged me too to do audiobooks of the science material. That's tough to do because of all of the reference material and all that kind of stuff. I think you probably have to have a really different format and do an abridged version to kind of put the major elements on it that way, and maybe with a link to the documentation, because it would be ridiculous. What are you going to read a bibliography? Yeah. So I'm not sure. Yeah, overwhelmed with political climate, do much else these days. Yeah, things are tumultuous. So I kind of stick with my core issues, which is to keep work on the second Rocks book and the third Fog novel. I'll give you a presence, little shorthand version. The first novel is literally Around the World in 80 Days with a mystery science fiction adventure backstory to it. So the kind of image you want to keep in mind, if you've seen the old 1956 David Niven Around the World in 80 Days, where it starts out with Edward R. Murrow in a standard frame, and then when they have the rocket launch early in the little description, suddenly the screen pulls out to this ginormous Todd A.O. picture. Well, that's the trick that I'm pulling in the story. That the Verne novel is here, and I'm pulling you out to find out what's going on over here. So functionally, everything that happened in the original book still happens pretty much as it does in the original book, but what's going on just out of your peripheral vision is very different. The one area where I definitely transformed everything is Auda. Sort of just gaming to stay sane. He should take all the space he needs. I wanted to establish a couple things. Vern did not do tremendously good character development. He didn't write gushy love stories, and frankly, I don't write gushy love stories. But I felt you needed to have the story of why Fogg and Auda end up getting married. What is about them that is causing them to be so in tune with one another? And Vern didn't do a hell of a lot of character development with Auda, so she's a blank slate. Well, in my story, she's anything but a blank slate. She's the smarter sister of Captain Nemo, and has all sorts of little gizmos and tricks up her sleeve and in her hat pin that keeps everything busy. And hopefully, when you read the story, you'll come to the conclusion, well, duh, of course Fogg and Auda are going to get married. I mean, is there a couple? Are they matched? Wow. So then the second story picks up where the first one left off, and it involves them tracking down. There is a particular airship that figures in the story that's run by a bunch of the villains, and what happens to that and the people that built it and how it connects up to people building like a super version of it figures in the second story. And it's got a bit more, spoiler alert, Phileas Fogg is the time traveler from H.G. Wells. So there's time travel, even more so in book 2 than in book 1. So basically, Sarasaki by protecting Saki and by extension me. Yes, indeed. The third story, then the second story expands the thing out. The original novel only took up 3 months. It's frenetic, and I wanted to keep that exhausting pace going in my version of the story. Second novel isn't really much bigger than the first physically, but it's actually covering about 6 months of experiential time, except in between, Fogg and Company are using the time machine to go forward in time a couple of years. And so it's actually sprawling across 6 years of time span. Well, what was going on in between for the Fogg who was living through that actual time frame? That's the topic of the third story that I'm currently working on. And so part of my brain is presently plopped down in Hartford, Connecticut in the summer of 1876, when certain people are chasing after the document that was stolen from the Foreign Office that described the events that had taken place in book 2 or in book 1 that got alluded to in book 2 with Major Grant. And so all of that stuff, tracking all of that material down, then leads to yet more mayhem happening in the third novel, especially the ones that could launch their own planes for scouting and protection. Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, there, for all practical purposes, that was the acronym Macon. I'm not sure that the Germans did much in that. They had little gizmos that they could drop down from their World War I style Zeppelins to use as observation things. And I'm not sure whether or not there was even a gunner involved in that. But the attaching an aircraft mode, locking up, there was a fictionalized version in one of the Indiana Jones movies of an airship that had an airplane locked in because Indiana and his dad escape, as I recall, from an airplane that's dropped from the bottom of this airship. I can't remember what the hell they called it. I don't think it was the Luxembourg. Luxembourg was the one in the Rocketeer. So there's a whole bunch of fictional airships knocking around. We just finished reading the original Time Machine. I don't know where the sequel written with the family's blessings. Yes, I deal. The original story is exceedingly vague, and a quirky little detail is that H.G. Wells wrote 2 time travel stories, not 1. The first one I don't think was ever published during his lifetime. and is involving a fellow who is experimenting with time travel in his little estate that he buys out in Wales, and gets the locals all up in arms, and he finally kind of has to escape, maybe in his time machine and maybe with one of the denizens of the village. Then he did something very, very different in the second story, the one that's the famous one that was in 1896, 7, around in that period. I am twisting the narrative a bit because I'm running off of the film versions of a lot of these things. So in that one, the time traveler is using the time machine in 1899, and I'm building off of that. Plus the issue of how did he come up with the stuff? Was there a precursor thing? I allude to in the first novel the idea that Fogg has tinkered with some inventions that his father had actually made that then got adapted and turned into the time machine that gets used in the late 19th century. And all of that stuff is going to be gone into in considerable detail in the subsequent novels, with great fanfare on book number 4. I've got a dozen of these things total organized. So I'm working on number 3, and there will be 9 more beyond that. I have the whole big arc going on, covering all the way out to 1908 and beyond, because they got a time machine, so they're going to be, they're going to even be on the ocean liner Normandy in the last novel, where they will be time traveling forward to the year 1936 to engage in some mysterious adventures involving people from an alternate timeline who are tinkering with stuff. So I've got a bunch of these material. But anyway, the acronym Macon, and I'll put that in our little Akron and Macon, for Akron, Ohio, and Macon, Georgia. They were our biggest airships that we built domestically. They both crashed, lost in storms. They had little airplanes designed to go up inside them, with helium inside, so they weren't blown up because of hydrogen. We were dealing with helium fairly early on. Almost everybody had terrible problems with airships. They're difficult to run. They're easily vulnerable. They have advantages in that they can hover indefinitely, and they're very energy efficient in terms of things, but they have a relatively low lifting capacity. So when you realize that the Hindenburg, which is the size of an ocean liner, had roughly the passenger capacity of a Concorde, it sounds impressive when you can get across the Atlantic in 2 days, when an ocean liner took 3 or 4. But when you can get across in 8, 9, 10 hours by airplane, eventually jet, pulling that down to 6, and then with a supersonic, you do it in 3.5, which we may have supersonics again. Don't think anyone needs to see. I'm still considering alluding to time travelers in my current novel, Cousin Day. Yeah, time travel. When I decided to have Phileas Fogg as a time traveler, I wanted to have some things that people hadn't seen in time travel stories before. One of the things that's very interesting about H.G. Wells's Time Machine is it's a literal speed up, slow down, fast, whatever, time machine. It's very different from the jumper style that you get with the DeLorean in Back to the Future. Even the TARDIS functions kind of like a jumper, which instantly materializes somewhere else, or rather travels through some wormhole-y thing, timey-wimey, and finally arrives at a point. And tends to have a life of its own, so it often lands him where the Doctor didn't plan on going anyway. And the Time Machine in Timeless, the rather interesting little TV series that was on a few years back, and a really neat design, a kind of spirally thing that's sort of like the mechanisms in the space warp device in Contact, except on a smaller time machine basis. That's another jumper. That moves physically in space and time on the Earth. They always stay stuck on the Earth. They don't have a thing. But theoretically, if you could somehow disengage the gravitational lock on the time machine of H.G. Wells, then the Earth would fly off into space as the time machine stays put in absolute space. So that I actually am playing off of as we move on, because eventually Phileas Fogg's going to make a flying time machine. That will be the Astronaut. useful in scouting the Atlantic for U-boats ahead of convoys. Yeah, although they didn't have much of a time to do it, because I think both of them were destroyed by 35, 36, 37, somewhere around in there. The Germans built one big airship after the Hindenburg. That would be the LZ 130. Which was to be the Graf Zeppelin II, but it never saw service. It did some spy work probing the new radar network that was put up in Britain just before World War II, but then Goring melted it all down for the duraluminum so he could build fighter planes. So there we go. Read a book about time travel about a lady from the 2200s that gets trapped in Holmes's hotel. Oh, Holmes lives in a hotel. That's kind of interesting. Sherlock Holmes, by the way, figures in the Paralogs novels repeatedly, as does Mycroft Holmes. In some respects, Mycroft is more of a character than Sherlock is. Although I have my fun with his ups and downs, because in the second novel, he gets shot. Not fatally, obviously. And all of the things that I've had to pay attention to is to make sure that all the detectives involved, that none of the canon gets interfered with. So all the things that Sherlock Holmes is doing in the stories, my stories, are things that aren't at odds with what we would be knowing he would be doing from somewhere else. Time machine would require a supercomputer capable of calculating the position of the Earth at the destination time relative to the departure time. Yeah, if it's figuring out. I think Wells just simply assumed that it's locked to the Earth's gravitation, and I play off of that trick, and then figuring out later on when the Astronef is built in the 1890s, all of the little fun and games that what you can do with a time machine that can do what Wells's style time machine theoretically could. And it's got a lot of interesting sidebar details that haven't been used in science fiction stories, and I'm certainly not in science fiction films, where almost all time machines are jumpers. And the idea that you can move fast or slow, and what it means to see things happening around you. All the film versions of the Wells story basically riffed off of that and then changed the subject. And you cannot contradict established canon. Well, I try not to contradict it. I have to play a little bit of tweaky. For example, there are elements in the original Verne novel, Around the World in 80 Days, that I had to bypass because they don't match up with reality. Scholars, for example, geeks, spotted the fact that the Fort Kearny garrison that in the novel Phileas Fogg recruits to rescue Passepartout, who has been swept off by Indians, wasn't there in 1872. It had been disbanded the year before. All of the stuff was farther east. There would have been no garrison there for them to fiddle with. And so I correct those little miscellaneous mistakes and render everything accurate. Plus, I had a field day finding all the little background details of, like, where does Passepartout get guns in San Francisco? What are gun stores like a dime a dozen, like Starbucks? And it turns out, delightfully, I was able to find business directory from San Francisco from 1872, so I could literally track down the details of things and where stuff was. So when you're reading the San Francisco section of the first novel, as you will be in all the other storylines where I have these things, I'm grounding it in an actual reality. So even though there are all these amazing devices beyond the core, the historical grounding of what a city looked like and what kind of train stations there were and how much things cost and all of that, I've tried to be as accurate as possible. James Tartuk and Jim Downer at H.H. Holmes Hotel. Oh, yes. Once they get the Astronef, they have basically a flying RV, and they don't need to bother about using ships and other transportation modes most of the time, because they can go when they like. In fact, they can arrive before they left. That's quite a different kettle of fish. But and by that time, they're bumping into Nikola Tesla, and there's a whole bunch of things that's happening by the time we get into the 20th century. When Doctor Who started, they often had to write scripts based on what sets the BBC. Oh, yeah. Well, that's if you want to have an absolute primer in what a low-budget TV series looks like, Doctor Who is it. They did not have a hell of a lot of things. It was a long time before the BBC started broadcasting in color. So it's well over a decade after the United States had switched over to color in the mid-1960s. And so it's a complicated thing. One of the things that then changed the way all television is done is the development of high definition, when you could get away with remarkably rudimentary sets in black and white. Things started to look like sets in color. So that's why a lot of the stories went for camp. So Batman and how the look of um, Man from Uncle and these other stories were that there's a bright, overblown look to it. And when you look at Mission Impossible and other series from that period, that sets look like sets. Well, high definition is so good that for all practical purposes, all TV series have to be filmed like movies. So the set details and the have to be done at a very high quality, even if they're got lath and plaster boards behind the thing. If you walked around the other end of the set, they got to look really good for the actual front filming. And it's transformed everything about television. So everything is done as a mini movie. When you look at stuff in science fiction realms, if you're looking at, say, the Discovery series in Star Trek, that's a mini movie, a hundreds of millions of dollar epic movie that's like 12 or 13 hours long that's sprinkled out through the episode thing. So the cost of these things is just motion picture level. Didn't understand camp, so I didn't get why the Batman show was popular. Yeah. Oh, it was, I was a little older, 14, when Batman appeared on the scene, and it was just it was just quirky as hell. It was almost serious initially, and then very quickly began to escalate, and it got so popular that it was shown twice a week. It's a half-hour series, and the audience for it just escalated, and the blip only lasted a few years. By the time they did the Batman movie with the TV cast and that, they were already kind of past their thing. They tried to spin off the Batgirl thing that didn't really kick off, and so it was an intense, quirky thing. Plus, it was just one of the draws of it was that almost everybody and his brother in the acting community would be playing a villain on it, and they could just go over the top with just wild extravagance and all of that. And it was just as silly as all get out. And it's on MeTV on a continual cycle. So if you haven't seen Batman, you can catch all of the episodes. Boom, just go on that way. I think you were only about 3 or 4 years older than I am. Yeah, born in 1952. And there was a creationist, McQueen, who just dropped dead, who was born the same year I did. So I'm one more that I've beaten past the mark on. Anyway, so let me put up. Oh, I should have put our thank you note for our patrons, because without that, things would be much more complicated than they are. And I'm well aware of the fact that it's not an easy shtick of holding on to all these things, given how murky our current finances are and economy, and it's going to get worse, kids, before it gets better. So I thank everybody that has remained a patron of the project. Anybody that feels overconfident and join the parade, I will thank you very much on it, and it will be added to the list. And if people can even stick with it that's on there, I will be well aware of all of that. So we've got that. Now we can proceed and put on our other thing, which is our cute little commercial for Rocks Were There Volume 1. Let me get that queued up. Takes a bit to get set up for my laptop here. My poor little wireless mouse that I got from my brother finally died, and it wouldn't accept new batteries. So I still got to wait and pick up one of those later on once I get past property tax at the end of the month. One thing after another. But anyway, enjoy Peter's commercial for our little Volume 1. And for our audio, Dead Air is an audiobook of The Rocks Were There is read by The Rocks. Yes, well, yes, for Dead Air, I think I've had some that may be beaten out. There was that, I think, Andy Warhol movie of a picture of the Empire State Building that's like 12 hours long and a bird flies by at one point, you know. And then, of course, you got John Cage's Sonata, which consists of him sitting at a piano with the lid down for like 20 minutes, and it's the audience, the no from the audience, grumps and coughs and all that. That's the air quotes composition. That's a little bit too meta from my point of view. At any rate, everybody stay uber safe. When I get the links up on that, take a look at those Notch papers, because especially the more recent ones, because it's really an intriguing thing on the insight of the nuts and bolts of what's going on in the genetics of the groups that are developing into human beings, and our rivals, Neanderthal and Denisovans, and all that's going on. And the fact that there are identifiable discrete variations in these Notch genes at that level of detail, and this kind of cascading effect is one of the arguments in the formation of why our cortical system developed the way it did. It was a feedback loop between this Notch and how it's regulated that may not have been occurring over in our cousins. Stooled in a 9-hour stream that was silent, just looking at a picture of a potato. Well, I hope it was an exciting potato. There are some asteroids and stuff that look very much like potatoes. I think the moon of, for a while there, Pluto seemed to be in that mode, and there's some weird little asteroids and stuff out in the not the Oort cloud, but the Kuiper belt, and that have some really funky little shapes and the like. Stuff apparently where things can gravitate together and it can form like dumbbell shapes and stuff. And there's complex histories that can be inferred from that now that we can actually go out and take pictures of a lot of this crap. But anyway, and more material for creationists to try to explain. Australia did a 6-hour stream with just her cats occasionally walking past. She was out of town. I hope I never get to that stage of mind-numbing boredom. One thing I did do, I bumped into, quite by accident, there was a little thing that I noticed on the little recommended feed, which often is stuff I'm not really all that interested in. But there was one where apparently there's a whole pile of quite young people who look at movies that for the first time. And these are typically people seeing movies that are kind of important films that they've literally never seen. And the one that popped up in my eyeballs happened to be Casablanca, which is my desert island movie. If I had to be stuck anywhere with only one movie to look at, that would be it, because my God, it's got Ingrid Bergman and Max Steiner's music and Peter Lorre saying, "You despise me, don't you?" And Claude Rains with his sharp dialogue and all the rest. So it was kind of funny to see the reaction of people to it. And I was fascinated to find out how many of them had never seen a black and white movie before. This was literally their first one. So that means they've missed out on everything from Citizen Kane to Inherit the Wind and the last Seven Samurai. And holy moly, there's an awful lot of black and white movies out there that they would never have seen. What intrigues me is how it sucks them in. And the other thing that was really intriguing about how slow on the uptake so many of these, some that are even couples that are watching these things, and they're just really slow to figure out that Victor Laszlo and Ingrid Bergman were a thing back earlier, and that clearly she had thought he was dead. I mean, this is like a really easy plot point to work out, and yet so many of the people watching this thing were like, "Well, what was going on back?" You know, and because the story eventually pointedly explains the details, they're able to connect the dots. But some noticed some of the lines over others, and they were all just blown away by the sudden plot twists of him shooting Strasser at the end of the story, and then Captain Renault turning and helping Rick at the end of the tale. 1984 for the first time tonight. I read the book decades ago. Oh, there's a whole bunch of 1984s. To contend with. There was one that I knew of from I think the first film version was in the 50s. I got Richard Basehart in it. And then it's been done various times since. There was a one with Richard Burton that I think was done in the 80s. And then there's been, I think, at least 1 or 2 versions since then. So it's a perennial, and it's, we'll wait for the musical, it's a real downer of a story. Oh, yeah, never watched Citizen Kane. Check out Citizen Kane. It's fabulous on so many levels. First of all, it's Bernard Herrmann's first film score. He had been working with Orson Welles off and on because he was in the music department at CBS, and Wells was doing The Shadow, and he was doing Mercury Theater, and there's a whole bunch of stuff, and often with scores by Bernard Herrmann. And so that's kind of how he figured out. And then he took the plunge when Citizen Kane was done. And it was breaking and forming rules all over the place. It's functionally the first film that's got, in an American film, that has distinctive ceilings. And that to have these, there were actually scrims that the lighting to light the sets had to be done through the stuff. So it was just a masterpiece of technical thinking. And films like Maltese Falcon that came out after that started to have ceiling elements in their stories. And so it was changing a lot. It's the most special effects laden film up until Star Wars. Most people don't think of it in those terms because it's not a science fiction story. But my God, the deep focus photography, the special optical effects, and the trick maneuvers of things, of sets that pull apart so that the camera can move backwards. I mean, the famous cut where he's pulling backwards from the little kid playing with the young Citizen Kane playing with the sled, and it pulls through and through the window, and then you're pulling back, and finally you have people that are sitting down at a table. Well, the camera had to physically move through the space that those things were in, and so the sets had to pull in and come together like a jigsaw puzzle. It's just absolutely amazing, and you still find little bits of that, of tricks like that were being done by Peter Jackson for Lord of the Rings stuff years and years later. They had to do a lot of that same stuff. And then it's got a ton of people that were doing their film debuts in the film. The script is just staggeringly ingenious and clever. And it's also not told in a linear format. So it's an amazing amalgam of a non-linear film that if you imagine taking Citizen Kane's sequences and putting everything in chronological order, it wouldn't be the same movie. Because there are things that you have a reaction to a thing. When the second Mrs. Kane is met in the film, you already know their marriage has fallen apart. You don't entirely know why, and you really find out the details of it quite late in the movie. But in the middle is where you find their first meeting. And what could have been an innocent, sweet little scene has a just dripping acid around it because you know how it's going to turn out from the beginning. And the telling of a story in nonlinear ways plays up in Lawrence of Arabia. We find out right at the beginning of the movie how Lawrence dies. And why? That means that the audience has no suspense at all when he's in times of danger. You have no idea. Oh, is he going to die? No, you know how he dies. It's on the motorcycle in the 1930s. So that means that your audience is now forced to look at things differently. And Hitchcock and others, there's so many different directors who have played around with that nonlinear storytelling in ways so that they are structuring how you're perceiving a thing rather than just simply putting the camera up and telling the story boring, boring, boring in the order that everything happens. So all of that, it's a primer on film form. And then dive in and catch, even though it's a truncated, bastardized version, that you should see the film he did next, Magnificent Ambersons, and at least up until about 3/4 of the way through, until the rest of it was not filmed by him. God, how a stunner that would have been if we'd had the original cut of that. Thinking about retrospect, I didn't realize how badly. Yeah, the script of Star Wars is fairly clunky, but it works tightly. I mean, I can't complain about it. And even there, the actors weren't entirely sure what they were doing, and they were, kind of almost walking through parts of it. And the fact that had Lucas had $35 million to spend on it instead of $9.5 million, I think it would have been a catastrophe because he would have done what he did in the prequel movies. It was just an overblown side issues that it would probably have not made back its production cost. But everything just kind of came together properly. And don't count out John Williams's music that had tremendous impact on that. It's absolutely spectacular. So anyway, love the old Hitchcock movies. Yes, indeed. That's I have more Hitchcock films in my video collection than of any other director. And he's also one that it's just a bit. Oh, finish another reason for seeing Citizen Kane. The film editor on Citizen Kane is Robert Wise, who went on to do The Day the Earth Stood Still and Sound of Music and Andromeda Strain and Star Trek: The Motion Picture. That the long thing is, so he is in that same tradition of Alfred Hitchcock and David Lean, who are film editors, who are seeing the movie frame, 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 one frame at a time. People who are film editor types have a different way of approaching the filmic experience and how they piece things together than you get from people who are like coming from the actor writer direction. John Huston, who could do both of those things. Frank Capra is kind of like a meat and potato filmmaker. Stanley Kubrick is also just a direct filmmaker who did his own editing. And then you've got ones like Billy Wilder, who are script writers, who then take to directing because they don't like how people direct their movies. So they start doing it themselves. So you can categorize different kind of directors, the kinds of films that, yipes, suddenly escaped my brain, sat on the chair during the Republican convention, conservative Republican guy, Rowdy Yates from Gunsmoke, or Wagon Train. Clint Eastwood. There we go. Finally took it. I read in. Lisa, catch Robert Wise's Andromeda Strain. It is one of my favorite science fiction films. Absolutely magnificent. There was a remake that was done for television that they basically changed the plot. Don't bother about that one. But the original one, it's got a wonderful cast, clever. It's got a political sharpness to it. It's taking place functionally in real time in the Nixon years. So there's a little bits about the politics and hippies and political bureaucrats in Washington and the whole issue about corruption of science for military purposes. There's a lot going on in there. And it's one of the most ungimmicky science fictions in so much of the equipment is real. I mean, and you're following through. How do you characterize things and what angstrom filter do you need to use? And how do you view things in an electron microscope and all that stuff? It's a delightful tale. And it's got a wonderful cast of people that typically did television stuff rather than film. A lot of them Canadians. I think that's part of the reason why they could do it on a relatively low budget. Almost everybody in there were Canadian actors. It's a delight. That's one of the science fictions that when it came out in 1970, I went to see it with a friend of mine several times because we were just blown away by the flow of it. And I don't typically go to science fictions all that often. The only other one that I would go to again multiple times was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I didn't even see Star Wars more than once. I just went once and that was it. So writes a good story but can't write an ending to save his life. There's first saw Citizen Kane, I was old enough to truly, I was always astonished it managed to pull off such an epic and huge project. Yeah. So I can definitely give you that. I'm over my hour. That's what happens when I start digressing on motion pictures and all of that. I'm very filmic in the way that I do the paralogue stories, and hopefully people reading them will get sucked into a world of a different way of speaking and a different way of acting, and yet it's not a 19th century fussy novel. It's sharp and quick, and the people in there are bantery and ingenious. I love stories like Casablanca and other films that have such sharp dialogue, Lion and Winter and all that. And I've tried to embody that in how snappy the Fogs and the people around them are. So shameless plug for the novels, plus I can use the royalties. So there we go. And we will be keeping at it because I got a hell of a lot of fun stories to deal with the Fogs. I love them as characters. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins. Watch out for rampaging Doge nincompoops and all the other mess that we're going to be going on in here until we can get everything straightened out. And of course, the Trump administration is going to be imploding because all of their policies, they're never going to be able to pull off what they want to pull off on a lot of this stuff. And it's going to be a mess with the pieces. And we will forever lose our position of global leadership because we'll never get it back, like virginity. Once you lost it, you got it. And poof. So anyway, everybody stay safe, and we will see you next week.